Alright, so in this video we want to talk about objects, so I'm going to delete everything here and start from scratch. So we already know how to define an object in JavaScript. We can just have a variable name and we will set this to curly brackets. Now within this curly brackets we will have our properties. So let's say I have an ID for this user and a name that I will set it to some string. Now, since we are inside TypeScript document, if we hover over user, you notice the type of each property is inferred for us. So we have an ID, which is type number, and a name, which is type string. That means if I try to set the username to a number, then I'll get an error because we are trying to set a number to a type string. And this will not give us an error in JavaScript. In fact, if I copy this and just bring it here just as a test, you notice there is no error down here. And let me comment this out because they have the same name. You can see we have no error because JavaScript doesn't care about what type is this name, and it could cause problems in our production. So this is TypeScript inferring the types for us, but we could also be explicit and say what are the properties and the types of each property in this user object. So just like any other variable, again, we want to define a type for this user object. We can add the colon and then we will provide curly brackets because it's an object. Now within this curly brackets, we can have our properties and their type. So we have an ID, we want this to be a number, and a name that we want it to be a string. So that means our user object should have an ID of type number and a name of type string. If I change this to, for example, fname, you can see it is giving me an error because it is looking for that property name. And of course, the type, if I change this to true, which is a Boolean, again, we have an error because we are saying explicitly we need a string. Now remember, we talked about that any type as well. So we can say this name could be any. But again, that is opening door to some errors because now I'm setting the name to true, which doesn't mean anything in a real world application. So I'm going to return that to a string, and this would be our simple TypeScript object. And of course, we get the same errors. If we try to set the name, for example, to a number, we will get an error. But if we set it to a string, that should be fine. Like this. Now let's say you want to have an object with optional properties. At the moment, we have ID name, and let's have another property, and I will call it isActive. That needs to be a Boolean. So you notice because we are now adding a new property, but we are not providing the value, we are getting the error, and it is complaining about the isActive property that needs to be declared. So in order to make this property optional, so we will not have this error, we can just add a question mark right after the property name, and you can see the error is gone, even though we have only two properties. And of course, we can still provide some value for that, and it needs to be a Boolean because that's what we specified here. If we add a string, we will have an error. So if you want to make a property optional, you can just add the question mark after its name. So it's property name, question mark, and then colon, and then the type. We could also change this value outside of this object. After we initialized our object, we can say user is active and set it to true or false. So that is a simple object in TypeScript with optional properties. And in the next video, we will talk about aliases.